Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Breaking the Barrier, How Marketers Can Optimize Accessibility and Compliance. We're excited to have you join us. My name is Megan Billingsley, and I'll be moderating today's event. We are thrilled to be joined today by Jill Grzalski-Robertson, Senior Vice President of Marketing at Valier, and Paul Morris, Director of Engineering and Accessibility Testing Services at Quality Logic. In this presentation, our speakers will discuss how marketers and business leaders can transform their digital strategies to overcome accessibility challenges. Before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping items. Please note the slides will advance automatically throughout the presentation. To enlarge the slides, click the Enlarge Slides button located in the top right corner of your presentation window. If you need technical assistance, click on the Help widget located on the bottom left corner of your console. We encourage you to submit questions at any time throughout the presentation using the Q&A widget at the bottom of your console. We will try to answer these during the webcast, but if a fuller answer is needed or we run out of time, it will be answered later via email. Please know we do capture all questions. After the presentation, you'll also be able to access the on-demand recording of the webinar using the same link from today's live event. So to kick off, I'd like to ask each of our speakers to provide a quick introduction of themselves and their work. So Jill, let's start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Megan. And hi, everyone. Jill Grzalski-Robertson, Senior Vice President of Marketing at Valier. We are a data-driven digital experience agency, so we help organizations across different industries create really impactful digital experiences rooted in strategy, data, and design. And we partner really closely with Acquia to deliver enterprise-level website redesigns and development. And we leverage a lot of Acquia's powerful, tools and suite of tools for long-term digital success. So excited to be here and excited to have this conversation.
Glad to have you. And Paul.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. My name is Paul Morris. I'm the Director of Engineering here at Quality Logic. I've been with Quality Logic for just 25 years in April, so I've just been there for a few minutes. Quality Logic is a 40-year-old quality assurance company. We've had a large accessibility testing practice for, ever since I went blind, which is about a decade or more ago. And we do full service accessibility testing services from auditing through to consulting, code remediation, that type of thing. So it's a pleasure to be here today.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So to start us off, let's talk about what we mean when we say web accessibility. And Paul, I'd like to hear how you define web accessibility.
Yeah, in the simplest terms, right, accessibility is ensuring that the maximum number of people can interact with any digital property by whatever means that they typically interact with the digital world. So whether we're talking about screen readers, alternative pointing devices, whatever that modality is, it's ensuring that people can interact through those digital properties. So right now, we think about accessibility and it means various things to various people. I'm seeing a lot of people just think about it as pure compliance, right? As in, I don't want to get sued. So we talk about the WCAG a lot. That is basically the guidelines of how things are assessed for accessibility. It's how people design for accessibility. So for me, though, it boils back to that first principle. We have to make a digital space that everyone can enjoy.
Excellent. Thank you. Can we unpack that compliance a bit? You mentioned WCAG. So what are some of the accessibility standards and requirements that marketers should be aware of?
Yeah, so, I mean, the WCAG is the king of the hill, right? So that was a standard that was developed by the W3C. It's kind of a gold standard, and it's what has been adopted into law by many different pieces of legislation. So it's at the root of everything. So when we think about, the EAA, the European Spirit Accessibility Act, when we think about the ADA, all of this comes into the WCAG at the root. And for anybody that's interested, the standard level right now, that's pretty much the world standard, is WCAG 2.1 AA. But that standard is widespread. It goes from a single A levels all the way up to AAA, and various conditions, physical limitations are all incorporated at various different levels, and the amount of accessibility somebody can enjoy is very much dependent on what somebody chooses in the WCAG to support. So I think that's where we stand, on where it all boils down to.
Excellent. Thank you. So just to follow up on that then, Jill, are there any standards that influencing marketers accessibility requirements?
Yeah, I think, as Paul mentioned, there's the American with Disabilities Act, excuse me. Really, I think that in addition to WCAG kind of starts as the umbrella as we're talking about accessibility, which is really focused on the ADA focused on prohibiting discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of public life. And what that boils down to from a digital perspective is really talking about websites, apps, and digital content, making sure that that's accessible to all users, including those with visual, auditory, and motor impairments. And then also, I think Paul mentioned Section 508. So making sure that all electronic and information technology developed and maintained or used by the federal government is accessible to people with disabilities. And so that also takes into account from a marketing perspective how we present and deliver digital content and different tools that are used in meeting specific accessibility standards. So, in addition to what Paul was mentioning around WCAG and the various levels of standards, those are some of the overarching kind of areas that are also influencing marketers and what standards and requirements we aim for and we meet when we're delivering in the digital experience space.
Excellent. Thank you. So now that we've established what web accessibility and compliance are, why do you think content accessibility is important for marketers and their audiences? Jill, what are your thoughts?
Sure. It's a great question, Megan. And, us as marketers, our focus and our job is really to increase brand awareness, to expand reach into various audiences, and ultimately move users through a journey or a funnel that takes them from aware or being a prospect to being a customer. And really the reason that accessibility is so important is because it supports broadening that audience and reach, right? A lot of organizations talk about their total addressable market. And we want to make sure that, as we're inviting people into a digital experience and we're moving them through a journey, that experience is accessible to all people that we are reaching out to. From an audience perspective, it's really important because marketers and brands in particular want to build a relationship with their audience, right? We want to establish a certain level of trust, and building brand loyalty, brand recognition, and nurturing audiences is really about meeting people where they are. And so accessibility and inclusivity in the digital experience is so important because when you're inviting someone in, you want that someone, regardless of ability, to be able to come to an experience or a site and be able to interact with the content, with the information that you are presenting, and find what they're looking for without any sort of friction, restriction, or different hurdles.
Excellent. Thank you. Paul, do you have anything to add about the importance of accessibility?
Yeah, and I'm going to echo some of the things that Jill just mentioned, but when we think about accessibility, right? When it comes to marketing, what's the point of marketing? We're trying to reach as many people as possible. Why would we want to invite or introduce barriers that prevent people from participating, right? At the end of the day, we're all humans and we all want to interact with the world and we all want to be included. Think of a marketing strategy that through sheer lack of knowledge of the situation that's there, we end up excluding people. That's not good for our brand. It's not good for the individual that's excluded. It just doesn't feel so great, And obviously, the elephant in the room right now, and we see it a lot in my world, is people are getting sued. The fact is, that between Title II and Title III of the ADA, there's a lot of latitude for people to get sued. This goes back to the Domino's case many years ago, where somebody wanted to just order their pizza online, and, well, frankly, they couldn't do it because the app wasn't accessible. That got the ball rolling. That's a long-standing case that's from many years ago now. And frankly, it's just gaining momentum. People realize, I think, that there's almost an attitude of, I deserve to be included. And if I can't get companies to pay attention to me, I'm going to turn to a lawyer. And I don't know. I can't say I'm a fan of that, but it's just the reality of where we stand today. There's one last final point that I want to get to, right? And that's when we think about accessibility, the way assistive technology interacts with a website is in, frankly, the best optimal way for a computer to interact with a website. And what does that mean in the big picture of marketing? Search engine optimization. And we've got good semantic headings on there. They follow a good structure. The website has excellent structure. That's really consumed by the search engines in a favorable way. It allows a search engine to build, a good map of where things are. It's good connective tissue for when people are searching for certain terms. Essentially, good accessibility on a website often then translates directly to good search engine optimization.
And just to build off of that, Paul, I think it's a really great point. And when we're talking about accessibility, it's not something that's after the fact, right? As an agency that helps organizations redesign and build websites and focus on content, like you're saying, SEO, as you're building that page and you're thinking about the header, it's not just about what does the header say, right? But accessibility is part of that. So it's not an afterthought, but it is so interwoven into all parts of a website and digital experience or digital app development process. And to your point, it has additional benefits, right? For a search engine, you're focusing on that optimized content. That's also what's good for a screen reader, right? And so it really is something that touches all parts of the process as you're taking something and going from ideation to putting it out in the wild and then continuing to evolve it over time. It's something that needs to be at the forethought of our process.
Excellent points. Thank you so much. There is a notable stat from Forrester's report, Taming Chaos, Optimize MarTech Stacks to Increase Effectiveness and ROI, that says 80% of respondents find it difficult to ensure that the content they produce is compliant with accessibility standards and requirements. So Jill, what are some common challenges you see marketers facing when creating accessible content?
Sure. Yeah. And I think it's important to note that, content there's a range of content, right? We can talk about written content, visual content, interactive and video content. And one of the challenges is really balancing the notion of big, bold design, right? Really flashy things and experiences that people want to put forward. There's continuing emerging trends for what, design in digital is and what people are adapting around scrolling and things like that. And being able to balance that and trying to make an impact with a lot of those efforts and balancing that with accessibility. From a design perspective, when we think of a brand style guide or brand colors, a lot of times we're establishing a brand or sometimes we're updating a brand and we're looking at, what do the colors mean? How do they make you feel? But we might not be thinking about, well, how does our primary color and our secondary color, if they're layered on top of each other, is that readable? Is it accessible? And so it's important to really think about accessibility in the upfront planning of all aspects of content to make sure that you're assessing the brand visuals, the content as it's written and how it's optimized, the language and independent, thinking about these as independent pieces that come together as a cohesive collection of a brand and making sure all of these components, whether they're standing alone or are being married together, are accessible. That's why oftentimes you'll see brands have different variations of their logos is a great example. You might have certain colors on logos. You might have kind of the inverse of a black logo with a white logo because you need to be able to have that applied in whatever instance or experience and make sure that it is accessible from like a visual design perspective. And so I think that's one of the main challenges. And a lot of times, as I was saying before, a lot of this effort is typically done when you're doing something for the first time or you're redesigning something. But on the flip side of that, one of the other challenges is really around maintenance. So as I mentioned, a lot of times accessibility is the focus when you're doing something new, you're launching something, but afterwards that focus may fall off a little bit. And so it's really making sure that organizations have the mechanisms in place to continuously make sure that they're meeting those accessibility standards that they've set out for themselves, and making sure that there's knowledge of accessibility across different teams so that as things change, there's constant accessibility checks and that we're able to stay on top of kind of the evolving accessibility guidelines in the space.
Excellent points. Thank you. Paul, could you share some examples of the challenges that marketers might face?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of this comes down to digital design, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you think about, I'll use case in point. When you, Megan, were introducing some of the housekeeping, instinctively, we talk to where things are visually, right? That's the norm for the vast majority of the world. I'll give you examples. There's a button on the bottom left, or you'll see that there are slides on the right, or any of these UI elements that are just natural for us to give when we're trying to communicate with each other. Well, now take all of that away. Somebody with a screen reader, when they're using their assistive technology, they have no clue what left and right typically means on a web property, right? So as a marketer, you have to think about how you're producing this content so it can be consumed by everyone. And if you start giving instructions, even in your marketing content, right, of, click on the box below. Well, okay, below actually does mean something, but click on the box on the left, that doesn't mean anything. When you think about a website, right, the best way to imagine what it looks like to a screen reader is delete your CSS file. It's completely bare and naked. Everything is just in one long linear list from top to bottom in the order it appears on the web page. So it's really important to consider that when it comes into play. The other thing I want to touch on, and this is a real one that trips up many people as they're styling their look and feel. They'll go, okay, I want this particular piece of text to look a certain way. And they'll grab a heading, just a random heading from their CMS. They'll style it, they'll make it look very pretty, they'll make it look a certain way, then they'll apply it to their website. Well, what if that's the first heading on a web page and it's a heading level 4? And then later on, you've got a heading level 2. And you're styling it based purely on your aesthetic appeal, right? You're making it look a certain way. Well, visually, that's great. But people with screen readers rely on things to be in semantic ordering, right? They're looking for a heading level 1. And under that, they're looking for children of heading level 2 and 3 and so on and so forth, so that they can keep track of where they are and what's relevant and how things tie together. That's critical, but naturally, right, when the marketer is first putting something together, how they want it to look, they're not thinking about it at a code level. They're not thinking about what those particular elements mean. They think about, oh, gosh, that's going to look pretty cool. Let's go ahead and make that larger. So we'll use a heading level 3 there. Well, okay, well, you can't do that and keep a cohesive experience going. Another good one, right? So this is something that people are getting better at, but they don't truly have the full context. So you ask people nowadays, if you've got a picture on your web page, let's ensure it's got good alt text on it. Well, good is somewhat subjective, but let's just say that people have taken a good stab at giving it some description, and it's there. Okay. Here's 2 examples where people don't think about it. Let's say that you've got an article and you've floated something to the right on your screen, right? So there's this intro text, or there's a block of paragraph of text about something, and then there's a picture. Well, what if your alt text is exactly the same, essentially, as the text that you just preceded it by? Or perhaps your text doesn't even give any kind of impression. I'll give you an example, one I just ran into in our own internal documents that I had to work with our team to correct. inside some sales material, there was a mini bio of me. And I'm like, that's awesome. But it was injected into the text where there was no context given for why suddenly it went from talking about the topic to talking about me. And I'm like, well, and then after that is a picture of me. And there was a nice description of how I look and all the rest of it, even though I learned through that, but I've got a gray in my beard. That was a shocker. But there was no context of why it was talking about me. Now, if I'd had that picture floated to the left, where that was the first thing that I encountered, and it had an alt text of a picture of Paul Marlin, and there's now a small bio that follows this. Now I've got some idea of why the text is there. I've got some introduction. So it's really important to consider about the context when we're trying to paint a picture for our users. And the other thing is, if that picture is just going to have the same text that's right next to it, why don't we just make it decorative and not display the picture at all to assistive tech? Because I don't want to read the same text twice, just like anybody else, right? So that's what I'd have to, as some examples of how marketers get tripped up in a pretty easy way when they think purely on that aesthetic styling piece of what they're trying to communicate to the user.
Yeah, that is incredibly insightful. Thank you. And I'm sure that many of the challenges that we've covered will resonate with marketers. So let's talk about how organizations can balance their accessibility challenges with content optimization workflows and cost efficiencies. Jill, can you give us some examples of how you're doing this at Valier and for your clients?
Sure. Yeah. So I oversee our Valier website. And so we're part of our own managed services program. So it's a nice little perk. But one of the things that we make sure to do is to schedule regular accessibility checks to make sure that because we're changing content often, we want to keep that optimization and workflow tight and make sure that we're not having to backtrack and adjust or address any sort of accessibility issues after the fact, after they've been out in the wild. And so for us, going through and having, regularly scheduled checks is really important for us, and making sure that if there's different touch points or ways that we need to review what we're putting on the site, that we're putting that into our workflow, again, so that we don't have to go all hands on deck further down the road to remedy it later. So that's how we do it internally. And then, for our clients, our project teams are comprised of a number of different individuals who are certified web accessibility specialists. And so they partner with our clients throughout the phases of the project. Like other agencies, we have a discovery phase as we move into design and functional specs, and throughout the build and the launch, we want to have those accessibility specialists along for the ride, right? So that we're not going into or going to commit to a design and get that too far down the road and then have to take a step back and say, hey, hold on, this doesn't meet the required standards. So we put in those resources to really hold ourselves accountable for our clients to make sure that we are meeting accessibility best practices, meeting their standards, and then really making sure that those specialists are not just guiding and building, but also testing those solutions for those best practices, including validating on different screen readers, checking for semantic markup, exploring the keyboard navigation, color contrast, thinking about font size, making sure the HTML and CSS is fully compliant with the standard set. So for our project teams, as we deliver work for our clients, that's how we help to make sure that, at the outset, that we're really balancing those workflows and making sure that that's something that they can maintain down the road. And then of course there's really a training aspect as well that's going to help organizations optimize workflows and cost efficiencies down the road.
Excellent, thank you. And following up on what Jill said, Paul, I'd love to hear how Quality Logic works with its clients on accessibility. Can you tell us about your approach?
Yeah, and I guess I can't help but go back to a little bit of the history, right? So I said earlier I went blind about 10 years ago. I've been sitting here doing the internal math. It was more like 17 years ago, but time flies when you're having fun. So when I think about accessibility. Part of how we service our clients is with the culture of accessibility. So naturally, as a company, we embrace it. Many people in our accessibility team have physical or cognitive impairments in their life. They deal with this, and using assistive tech is their natural way to interact. That's why they're part of our test team. That's why they exist. So the way we really service our clients is, first and foremost, we meet them where they are. A lot of people haven't even considered accessibility. They know they need to do something. They reach out to us and they need a subject matter expert. So we interact with them and we'll help a client in any way that they really need. So whether that's they need an audit performed to find out where they are, whether it's building them a roadmap or strategy of how they can become accessible over time. Perhaps they need code remediation help. Maybe they need anything from internal education, right? So we've talked a little bit about the trouble that marketers face. Well, sometimes having a training session with somebody like me can be awfully insightful for a digital designer or for a developer. So we provide every level of guidance to our clients. But the big deal is that we come at this from a very human-first perspective. There are many providers out there, and a lot of them are very tool-centric. And there's some excellent tools out there, but at the end of the day, we're talking about interacting with human beings, and the tools don't really have the context to be able to do connective reasoning, right? So this is a heading level 1 that says this. Does the heading level 2 make sense in that context? Very few things are making that connective leap, whereas a human, they know that they're having problems. And I'll take it back to the beginning of why accessibility. We talk about WCAG, but most of the people that are being serviced by the WCAG don't have any clue what the WCAG is. They just know they're having problems. And so we'll certainly help the client, get an accessibility statement on their website, give people that are having problems paths to reach out to where they can get assistance. It's really about that full service culture to ensure that the people we're serving, our clients, can service the maximum number of people in the world. It's really that simple.
Great insights. Thank you, Paul. Do you have any strategies you recommend to help organizations create more accessible digital experiences?
Yeah, so we think about the strategy. So if we start at the beginning, right, let's say that you've got a website. You didn't build accessibility first, you've got a website. Well, I now want to ensure that everyone can interact with that. So a client's going to come to me and say, help, give me a strategy. So for them, it's probably going to look like we're going to perform an audit. And what that audit is going to do is produce a ton of issues that they then have to remediate. That is a fire hose for a lot of people. It's their first engagement with accessibility. They don't know much about the subject matter at all. So it's a case of, okay, we do the audit. We now have a backlog. That's at least something that developers can now chew on. It's digital design can chew on, right? It's whether we have to rebrand colors. It's whether we have to do fundamental architecture. All of these things, that all comes into play. And then we can look at that roadmap and help people build it. So it's a journey. And the first thing that people think is, well, I just want a one and done audit, get it out the door, I'm good. Websites, all digital assets are living entities in and of themselves, right? So nobody just builds a website and then just lets it sit. That's what they did. That's where it sits. It's continually evolving, and therefore your accessibility has to continue to evolve. Be it an accessibility compliance report, that has to evolve with you. So it's about building that roadmap. It's about making measurable timeline that you can make improvements. And ultimately, and this is really critical, being held accountable to that timeline. If you promise that you're going to be accessible in 6 months, well, you need to be accessible, or at least have a good amount of progress to show to explain where you got to and why. All too often, I've seen a roadmap that was developed and then abandoned. And fortunately, there's now a trend to building a roadmap and actually making it into reality.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So throughout our conversation, you've both given some excellent insights to help marketers, but knowing where to begin with accessibility can be daunting. So Jill, what are some of the first steps marketers should take towards creating more accessible content?
Sure, it's another good question. And so I would say, and Paul touched on this a little bit, I think there's kind of three key points that helps make this approachable, right? You need to understand, you need to audit, and then you need to educate. So in terms of understanding, that is about understanding where your organization wants and needs to be from an accessibility standpoint. A lot of times things can feel unapproachable, or we don't want to get started because we think it's going to be this massive undertaking, right? But if we understand where we are and where we need to be, that will help, as Paul was mentioning, build that roadmap and figuring out what's, the minimum standard that an organization is working towards. And Paul earlier touched on WCAG 2.1 level AA is typically the best practice standard today, but again, there are different levels. And so figuring out and understanding where you need to be and where you want to be is the first step. And then, as Paul was alluding to, you really want to make sure that you're auditing, right? For us, we partner with Acquia. We use the Acquia optimized tool for a number of our clients to help kind of streamline that accessibility scan process. That way we can catch any issues, put together that remediation plan, as Paul was mentioning, and really work through that roadmap. And then the last piece is around education. And so again, I think there's small steps in each of these that can be taken, but it's so important that your whole organization, and marketers in particular, really do research and educate themselves both on the accessibility guidelines, but also on how your digital experience is managed. So as Paul was mentioning earlier, if we're moving certain headers around because we like the style, we have to understand and educate ourselves on the implications of doing that for somebody on the receiving end of that experience. And so I think, trying to break down certain milestones in terms of understanding the requirements, auditing to know where you are and how far away you are from that target, and then constant education, I think are ways that, people can start small and grow into it and really kind of get the ball rolling from an accessibility perspective.
Excellent. Thank you. Paul, what do you notice that marketers might miss when they're beginning the accessibility initiatives?
Well, fundamentally, one of the first things I'll say that people miss is the people, right? So I know that we've talked a little bit about what it's like to use a screen reader. If we think about that from a bigger picture, I think most marketers, when they're starting down this journey, truly have no idea what it's like to interact with a digital world through assistive technology. One of the most entertaining things that I do for my clients is I actually get on a call with them and I stream my screen reader to them so that they can hear it and they can hear the problems on their mock-ups or on a digital website. They get to hear the problems that I encounter and it makes it real. So that's a great foundational piece, just so that somebody can get to grips with, what is this audience that I'm trying to serve? Who am I trying to serve beyond the obvious? But let's get into a few little bit more esoteric things. Okay, I'm going to build a new marketing website. So I've grabbed a CMS, I've grabbed all of these cool plugins, I brought them together into a look and feel, and I'm super happy with how it looks. And I click through it and it looks great. Well, okay, your company that owns this marketing website is now responsible for the fact that, is the CMS accessible? Are those third-party widgets you brought in accessible? All of those cool elements you brought together, each one is part of the corpus. It's part of the body of work. And you're responsible for all of it at the end of the day. So that's where you can't just accept that the library you're pulling assets in from, I'm going to name a name here, the mega menu. We probably, a lot of people that have been around any WordPress site for any time have heard about the mega menu. that was completely inaccessible for many years. I don't know how it is today. It may be great today, but it's something that tripped a lot of people up. They brought in the asset, and that's fabulous. I hope it's now really good. But back in the day, several years ago, when I first encountered it, it would trap my screen reader. I couldn't get out of it. It was confusing. It was a terrible experience. But ultimately, and we had this on our own website, so I'm fully accountable for it. It was a real problem area, and we never even thought about it when we built our own website. And kind of egg on the face there, we had to own that and then refactor it and take that out and find something different that was accessible. It's very embarrassing when you actually have to look in the mirror, find out you've been doing something that isn't best practice. So that's what I would suggest to anyone that's starting down this journey is get to know the people that are going to know and use your product, and ensure that you are doing adequate research into all of the things that you intend to use as your designers are bringing this website together. Ultimately, it's your responsibility to have that experience. So really critical that you do your research, and frankly, that you can't trust it, you have to test it. There's a lot of people that, because this is a deep and wide subject, they're claiming accessibility because of the testing that they did. If it's not being done by subject matter experts and it's not being thoroughly evaluated with all of the available tools that are out there, they're probably not as accessible as they like to believe they are.
I think, just to add to that, Paul, I think it's a really great point. A lot of times, and I've seen this, at other agencies I've worked at, a lot of organizations, they're spending a good amount of money when they're doing a redesign of a website. And a lot of times, they will invest in user research, but that user research on prototypes or the initial designs is almost always about how does it feel? Can a user, navigate the site? But accessibility is not often part of that user research. And that's such a great checkpoint that's already built into the process to introduce that accessibility testing, to exactly to your point, to make sure that someone who is using a screen reader can also get through the site and navigate the experience the same way that they're doing in the user research that they're already focused on. And so it presents a real natural kind of injection point to be able to make sure a site is accessible before it gets too far down the road, especially when you're making such a large investment in creating a new experience.
Excellent. Thank you, Jill and Paul. That was a really enlightening presentation on a topic that definitely needs to be addressed by marketers. And I think that's also a great note to end on. So thank you all so much. In the time that we have left, I'd love to shift to some questions from our audience. So here's the first one. It says, I often see accessibility statements on websites. Is this something I need to add? Paul, you want to take this?
Yeah, sure. And the simple answer is yes. I will elaborate more than beyond yes. The fact is that the accessibility statement tells a person several things, but it also is a key point of entry when somebody's struggling, right? So one, I've got an accessibility statement. That means I take this seriously to some extent. It's not the be all and end all, right? It's not actually doing more than declaring that you thought about it. So when I voyage into that accessibility statement, there's some other things that need to be in there, such as your most recent accessibility compliance report would be great. Maybe a link to your roadmap showing where you are in your accessibility journey. But one of the most critical things to have in there is an open and honest declaration of where you are in your accessibility journey, making certain people know that when you last made that declaration so that we can ensure that it's being held accountable, but ultimately also that I've now got a path to reach out to if I'm having problems. One of the big things that I have found in my own life experience as a blind individual is there's a lack of being heard. People do it without thinking. People isolate you without thinking. There's a lack of being heard. By giving people something to reach out to, there is at least a way for them to be voicing their opinion, to be heard. And the only thing I always say is, if you're going to have it in there, be responsive to it, be mindful to it, and be aware that you're going to get some awkward questions come through that medium. So it's really about very honest look in the mirror that we have to be prepared to take on any given day when people give us feedback. We're not going to like some of that feedback, but we need to be open and honest about it, and then give people a realistic expectation of when you're going to have the problem solved. Because I don't see this going anywhere. It's just going to get more and more attention in our world.
Yeah, thank you so much. This next question, Jill, you addressed this a bit. So how do you stay on top of all the accessibility rules and regulations?
Sure. There's a couple of different ways. There's ways to review updates to the WCAG guidelines and staying attached to different announcements. Of course, there's newsletters and blogs where you can stay informed of changes in best practices or industry trends, Also thinking about how do you tap into the internal resources at your organization. A lot of times, accessibility standards may not live within marketing, right? If you have a legal or compliance department, those guidelines may be coming from that team. So I think it's always helpful to understand who's the subject matter expert around accessibility within your organization, and either connecting with that person on a regular basis or perhaps implementing, we do bite-sized learnings at Valier, or lunch and learns that are maybe quarterly or at a regular frequency, so that that person or a few people who are the experts can share that information with the organization on the whole. Accessibility rules and regulations, all of that information is not something that one person should hold selfishly, right? Everyone in the organization should be on the same page. And so I think, identifying, kind of who oversees that within your organization and making sure that there's really open communication, so that as things change, the entire company is aware, an action plan can be put together if there's any sort of action or remediation that's needed. And then, thinking about, just in terms of staying on top of kind of your own accessibility performance, thinking about different tools, making sure that you're identifying issues that way. So really, I think it comes down to being proactive in the space. Again, we talked about it not being an afterthought. And so making sure that for you yourself, if you are owning a digital experience, that you have reminders to, get up to speed, to read what's happening, you have the appropriate alerts, and then also leaning on other people in your organization to support that as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Paul, next question I'll send to you. What are your thoughts on accessibility self-assessment tools? Are they useful?
Well, they are. And frankly, there's something which anyone should be automatically introducing and adopting and putting into their systems when they're doing builds, right? So there are some great ones out there, from Wave to AxDev. There's a ton of tools out there. The real beauty part is that each tool has its own use case, right? So the fact is that you'll find some issues in one tool, you won't find them in another. That's a great starting point for anyone that's doing any kind of digital development. I always recommend get the tools. Make the auditor's life a little bit easier by catching what we consider to be the easy stuff, right? It's going to highlight it on screen. It's going to show you what the problem areas are. It's a super nice and easy thing to do to, frankly, check your own work. It's great to have. I do want to touch on something that Jill mentioned, though, in the regulations. We've talked a lot about WCAG 2.1 AA, as in that's kind of the standard. Mm-hmm. It's not even the most recent, right? But the most recent is actually 2.2, and that's been out for quite a while. So I did want to touch on that, because when we're talking about tools, or when we're talking about decisions that we're making, it's really important to understand what you're trying to embrace and what you're trying to achieve, right? The tool isn't going to do everything you want it to do, but if you're also electing to do WCAG 2.1 AA, you are intellectually making the decision to not support any of the criteria under 2.2 AAA. So we have to consider that as when we're building our tools, we're building our strategy. when we choose to not adopt the latest and greatest and highest end standard, we are making a decision to do a partial piece of work. So the reason I bring that into tools is because it's highly relevant. If you think the tool can assess everything and you're good to go after using a tool, you're not going to be correct. The tools are great, but they can only do so much, and it's important, again, to take it back to the humans, the subject matter experts, the people who live it and breathe it, and have that full end-to-end thing. The last point I'll finish on there is it's actually possible to build a fully compliant experience, yet still have a very confusing user experience. And as a marketer, it's all about user experience. So getting that additional feedback, the context, getting the human experience involved, super critical.
Great points. Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question. So Jill, we'll end on this one for you. You'd mentioned starting with the smaller accessibility items. What would be some to look for?
Sure. I think one of the low-hanging fruits is specifically around alt text for images. A lot of times organizations are working with an SEO agency or have an SEO team that are constantly crawling the site, identifying missing meta information, and part of using an SEO tool like Screaming Frog, for example, identifies where you're missing alt text for images. As Paul mentioned, at the start of this, there's SEO benefits to some of this accessibility work, and having alt text for images is one of those. And so making sure that all the images on the site have descriptive alternative text so screen readers can really convey their meaning to visually impaired users, I think is a great first step. Thinking about color contrast is another one. So, just taking a look through the site, making sure that you're using accessible color combinations with the sufficient contrast between any text and the background to make sure, that there's readability and supporting that. And I think maybe a third to throw in is also thinking about, enabling keyboard navigation. So making sure if it's a website or an app that it can be navigated using a keyboard. Paul mentioned the mega menu, and, making sure that for users who aren't able to use a mouse, that they're able to still navigate the site. And so I think those are some kind of three core areas where you can start small, right? You're able to really do that assessment, make iterative changes. And I think that's the big thing too. And Paul hit on this, this is not accessibility, and making an experience accessible and getting up to standards is not just a one-time thing. This is something that requires maintenance. It requires constant attention. It requires training for different teams so that as you're handing off a campaign landing page or someone's helping to maintain an experience, that we're not falling into that trap of moving headers around because they look better, but it's not following that semantic order. So I think that's another piece of it too, is just getting in the mindset that this is something that should always be addressed, right, and becomes part of the process. And that will make sure that once you kind of go through that roadmap and get up to standard, that it's part of the everyday, and you don't have to keep undergoing all of these big efforts to get from where you are up to standard. It just becomes part of the everyday.
Well said. All right, well, that is all the time that we have today. A big thanks again to Jill Grzelski-Robertson from Valier and Paul Morris from Quality Logic for their time and expertise. And of course, to our audience for joining us. As a reminder, this webinar will be available on demand and a link will be sent to you. Have a great day, everyone.